The wind howled through the skeletal trees, carrying with it a whisper of something unseen. Sarah Whitman stood at the window of her childhood home, watching as snow swirled in the moonlight. She had spent years running from this place, from the ghosts of memories buried beneath the frost. Yet here she was, back in Vermont, back in the house that had never quite felt like home. The silence was different now. Not just the quiet of isolation, but something heavier, pressing against her skin like a held breath. The farmhouse was as she remembered, aged wood, the faint scent of cedar and old books, but something about it felt wrong. She couldn't shake the sense that she was being watched. Then came the first sound, a faint tapping at the window, almost imperceptible beneath the groan of the wind. Sarah stiffened, her breath curling in the cold air. Probably a branch, or the house settling. That's what she told herself. The tapping came again, this time from the opposite side of the house. Sarah's stomach twisted. Her fingers hovered over the lock, debating whether to check outside. But then she saw them, faint impressions in the snow just beyond the porch. Footprints, leading toward the house, but none leading away. She swallowed hard. The air smelled metallic, sharp and cold. A shadow flickered just beyond the tree line, shifting unnaturally. Sarah took a step back from the window, heart hammering. She wasn't alone out here. And whatever was watching her, it wasn't human. Sarah arrived at the farmhouse just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the snow-covered fields in hues of deep blue and violet. The house loomed before her, its weathered wooden panels creaking softly in the wind. It had been years since she last set foot here, since her father's passing had severed her final tie to the place. She stepped onto the porch, the old boards groaning beneath her weight. The key turned with surprising ease in the lock, and as she pushed the door open, a familiar scent met her: dust, aged wood, and a faint trace of something metallic. The same smell that had clung to the house when she was a child. Memories stirred. Nights spent under heavy quilts, listening to the howling wind. Her father's hushed warnings about the woods beyond the property, tales meant to keep her from wandering too far. Yet she had always felt there was something more to his words, a hidden truth buried beneath his cautious tone. Now, standing alone in the dim light of the hallway, she felt it too. A presence. The air was thick with it, pressing down on her like the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. She moved through the house, each step kicking up tiny clouds of dust. In the kitchen, the old clock on the wall had stopped, its hands frozen at a time she couldn't quite decipher in the gloom. The back door rattled in its frame, though there was no wind strong enough to move it. Then she saw them, faint impressions in the snow outside, leading to the porch. Just like before. And still, none are leading away. Her breath hitched. The past she had tried so hard to leave behind had been waiting for her all along. Sarah wandered the dim corridors of the farmhouse, each step stirring up the dust of memories she'd buried long ago. The cold bit through her sweater as she traced her fingers along the walls, feeling the faint indentations of scratches in the wood, marks she didn't remember being there before. That night, the tapping at the windows grew more persistent. First the kitchen, then the living room, then the upstairs bedroom where she had once slept as a child. When she gathered enough courage to peek through the frost-laced glass, she saw nothing but the moonlit snow stretching into the woods. Yet the footprints remained, closer now. In her father's old study, Sarah unearthed the journal he had always kept locked away. Pages filled with frantic handwriting detailed nights of hearing whispers, of seeing shifting shadows in the snow. One entry chilled her to the core. It waits in the frost, watches from the tree line. Each winter, It grows bolder. I must not let it in. A gust of wind rattled the windows. Sarah shut the book with trembling hands. When she turned toward the doorway, a dark figure loomed there, tall, silent, its breath visible in the freezing air. It had come inside. Sarah stood frozen, breath clouding in front of her as the shadow stepped forward. It had no defined face, no true form, just the suggestion of a human shape carved from ice and darkness. Its presence sucked the warmth from the room, frost creeping along the floorboards, consuming everything in its path. Her father's journal lay open on the desk beside her. I must not let it in. The words burned in her mind, but it was too late. It was already here. Sarah stumbled back, her heartbeat hammering in her ears. The thing moved with unnatural grace, silent except for the brittle cracking of frost beneath its shifting limbs. Its presence felt like the depths of a frozen lake, endless, suffocating. Desperation clawed at her throat. She grabbed the fireplace poker, swinging wildly, but the metal passed through the figure like mist. A cold laugh, like ice grinding against itself, echoed through the room. Then she remembered. Fire. Heat. The only thing that could fight the cold. She lunged for the old kerosene lamp on the mantel, her trembling fingers struggling to strike a match. The moment the flame bloomed to life, the shadow recoiled, its shape distorting, shifting erratically. Sarah didn't hesitate. She hurled the lamp to the floor, the glass shattering, flames licking hungrily at the old wooden planks. Heat rushed through the space, driving back the dark thing. It let out a shriek, high and keening, like the wind through broken trees. The last thing she saw before she ran was the fire devouring the shadows, chasing them back into the frost from which they had come. Sarah didn't stop driving until she reached the first gas station miles away from the house. She pulled into the lot, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles ached. The warmth of the Jeep's heater finally reached her, but the chill deep in her bones refused to fade. She sat there, unmoving, staring at her reflection in the rearview mirror. Her skin was paler than before, her eyes wide, the faintest trace of frost still clinging to the edges of her hair. She forced herself to breathe, slow and steady, trying to convince herself it was over. The cashier inside the station gave her a curious glance as she stepped inside. The bell above the door jingled, startling her more than it should have. She grabbed a cup of steaming coffee and wrapped her hands around it, savoring the warmth, grounding herself in something real. "Cold night, huh?" the cashier said, ringing up her purchase. Sarah hesitated before nodding. "Yeah, unbelievably cold." She debated telling someone what had happened. But what would she even say? That she had been chased by a shadow made of ice? That something inhuman had nearly stolen her breath, her soul? No one would believe her. She stepped outside, staring down the long dark road. The wind had died down, and the snow had settled into an eerie stillness. She wanted to leave, to never set foot in that house again. And yet she knew she couldn't just abandon it. Not without knowing for certain. A small voice in her mind whispered that it was over. The creature was gone. She had burned it away. And yet, somewhere in the distance, a soft tapping sound echoed across the lot. Faint, rhythmic. Sarah turned sharply, breath catching in her throat. But there was nothing there. Just the wind. Or so she hoped. The snow had started falling again, covering the road in a fresh, pristine layer. As Sarah climbed back into the Jeep, she glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. The frost on the glass had returned. and in its delicate, swirling patterns, she swore she saw the imprint of a hand reaching toward her. With a shudder, she turned the key and drove away, leaving the past and the shadows behind. At least, that's what she told herself.